If you are stuck in the loop, if you feel like you can't finish any music and you struggle with arrangement in Ableton Live, then this video is exactly what you need. In this tutorial right here, I'm going to show you the easiest and most effective arrangement method I've ever used. I call this the skeleton arrangement technique, and it works super well in electronic music genres like techno, house, and EDM. So most electronic music producers get stuck in exactly that phase of transitioning from a core loop into a full arrangement. My technique is going to help you with that. It's going to make this much easier. But first of all, let me show you what we currently have in our loop. So I will start with the foundation of the track and then bring in elements one by one. So this is a pretty deep, atmospheric, yet melodic track. It has a hypnotic lead line, and the question is, how do we now transition from our core loop into an arrangement? And by the way, if you want to finish at least one great sounding song per month, I have a free gift for you. It's called the Finisher Framework. You can get it at pickyourself.com/framework. It's an entirely free gift from me to you that will help you with finishing tracks by implementing a creative system that does all the heavy lifting for you. Get it at pickyourself.com/framework. The link is also in the description. Let me now walk you through the skeleton arrangement technique step by step. Now, you're probably wondering, why the hell is this called skeleton arrangement? The idea here is that we create the bare bones of our arrangement super quickly, and then we add flesh to the bones. So step one is to identify the one core element that you want to use as your sonic storytelling tool. Now, in my case, this would be the lead synth. This sequence offers a lot of possibilities to play around with the modulation and automate certain parameters, and this is exactly what we need. Step two is to select the kick drum pattern or some core drum loop together with your lead element that you defined earlier. Go over to the arrangement window and you just paste it there. Make sure that they are both equal length, and then you're ready to go. Now, step three is to duplicate this for the entire length of your track. Don't worry, this is going to make a lot of sense in a few minutes. Stay with me here. You select those tracks and you duplicate them for the entire length of your track. And it doesn't really matter how long it is. I go for something like 6 minutes. So this gives us already a representation of, okay, our track is almost finished. This is a very nice psychological hack for you. So you are already out of your loop. You have something longer going on. Now we go into the nitty-gritty of how to turn this into an interesting arrangement. This next step now is the most important one. You have to define a couple of modulation parameters in your lead element. This is going to be a game changer for you. Go into your synth and try to figure out a couple of modulation points that make a lot of sense, that give you some emotional response. I'm going to show you how this is done. So we have a patch by Ableton Drift. So it's relatively plucky, it's leading into an echo that is then being fed into a hybrid reverb. Now what you want to do now is to group all of this into an instrument rack. So you hit Ctrl G, you open up your instrument rack, and then you see the macros here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to figure out a couple of interesting modulation points in our synthesizer setup and also in the following effects. And then we're going to map them to just one macro and define the parameters really, really well. This is going to allow us to paint the sonic picture in one go without having to overthink it or without automating tons of parameters. So the first obvious candidate for modulation and automation is the filter cutoff, of course. As you can hear, there are a lot of really nice sweet spots within that, and we're going to map this to macro 1. Now this macro controls our filter cutoff, and the cool thing about macros is that you can map multiple parameters in your synth patch and the following effects to just one macro, and this one knob here controls a lot of different things. Now, we have to be really careful what we map to here and also how we map this. So when I listen to this synth sound, I want it to close down and open up in different ways. I also want it to become a bit more aggressive when I open this macro, and I want the sound to flood the entire frequency spectrum. So this allows me to then create tension and release with just one macro. So a couple of other parameters that I wanted to look at are, for example, the amount of noise, the release time, so the actual shape of the amp envelope. And also things like how much of the delay feedback is happening, how big the reverb is. These kinds of parameters all make a lot of sense. You can also go into a more experimental direction and, for example, play with the detuning of a synth or changing the shape of the waveform. All of this can be super interesting. Let's try this out now. So first I'm going to map the noise to this. And as you can tell, it's already pretty interesting. So this gets noisier and noisier, and you can use this automation map here, if you select map, to define how extreme this goes, where it starts and where it ends. So for example, with the noise, I probably don't want as much noise in the maximum setting. So I'll just bring this down here. And I could do the same thing for the low pass frequency. I could say, okay, this is always starting a little bit higher and maybe not opening up completely if I want to. But there is much more that we can do. So the next thing that I will add here is a little bit of a change in envelope. So for example, I want the amp envelope to have a bit more release when I open this up. So the notes get longer. Same thing. I will map this to macro 1 and I will see how this sounds. So here you can tell, okay, this is getting way too extreme. And then you go into this and take this down. So it's just adding a little bit of release. Fantastic, this is exactly what I wanted. Now this is where the fun part begins. I'm going to share with you some of my secret weapon modulation points that I absolutely love and that you probably haven't even thought of. But before we get to that, if you got any value out of this video so far, then consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. It really means a lot to me. It helps me stay motivated and put out new content, but it also helps you because the algorithm will suggest better videos to you. So all in all, I think it sounds like a win-win. Now let's get back to the tutorial. So one of my favorite modulation points is actually the shape parameter here in Drift. So what this does is it just changes the shape of the waveform. As you can see, this is the waveform display. So it becomes more metallic, so to speak. And once again, I think it's a little bit too extreme. So I'm going to go in here, oscillate the shape, and I'm going to make this a bit less extreme. As you can tell, the synth patch becomes more and more expressive. I really love how this turns out. Another favorite of mine is modulating the feedback inside an echo. So map it to macro 1. And once again, you have to see how extreme you want to go. Oh, this is so cool. There's this incredible crunchy distortion happening when you go above 100% feedback. And obviously you can also map it to the wet dry and see like, okay, maybe it starts without any echo at all. And then later on, as the feedback gets more extreme, you also bring in a bit more of that wet sound. This is especially powerful if you go into a breakdown section, for example. So let's just do this. Map it to macro 1, so make this less extreme. Don't want a 100% wet sound in the end. Very cool. So I think at this point you understand the principle, but what are you going to do with all of that? How are you going to create this skeleton arrangement right now? This is exactly what I'm about to show you in the last section of this video. You're now going to use this one macro to tell a story of tension and release in your song with this one synth. And no, this is not going to be the final be-all end-all solution for your arrangement, but it is giving you a sonic and emotional guideline, which helps you then later on finish the final arrangement. And I think this is much cooler than working with an arrangement reference track, because it is you, it is more unique, it is your way of expressing the sonic story of this song. So there are two ways of doing this. You can do it completely by feel by using a controller, something like the push or something like this APC, and you map your controller to this macro and basically go by feel. You close your eyes, you just let the music play, and you tell this story. If you don't have a controller, no problem, you can still open up the automation lanes, you hit A, and then you paint it in. So this is very easy to do, it takes zero effort, and if you struggle with this, if you don't know where tension and release are supposed to happen, yes, you can still import a reference tracks and just make little markers and tell yourself, okay, this is more or less where the track should open up and this is where it's kind of closing down again. So I've done a first super rough pass of this. So this is more or less what I want this story to feel like. A little bit of an intro, some small build-ups, then bringing it back again, opening it up again. And then here, this is going to be my main breakdown where it slowly builds up to a very extreme point. Yes, I'm going to play this for you. This is the most extreme point here. And then I bring it down. And then it's like slightly opening up, down, up, down. So you get the idea. I'm painting this sonic picture. I'm telling this sonic story just with this one tool. And even if in the end, in my final arrangement, it's not going to play exactly like this, it already gives me a super nice guideline to work off. This is more or less the skeleton of our tracks, and we can now add flash to this. Let's, for example, go to the kick and filter out the low end of the kick on some parts. So good old DJ trick, use the auto filter, and we're going to use the high pass. So here, the filter frequency of the auto filter is something that we want to modulate. And we can do the same thing for other parts. Maybe even remove the kick in some parts. So let's say here. Same here, we can filter it out. Maybe then delete it for some parts here. This is in the middle of our breakdown. So we're just painting the same sonic picture with our kick drum. We're filtering it out even more extreme towards the end, and then obviously dropping the bomb again here. Here you have to be really careful. You have to zoom in and make sure that when you want the kick to hit, that this automation lane is not somewhere after the first beat. So sometimes Ableton draws it in like this or so. Really important to be super precise here. You want it to hit exactly at the sweet spot. Same holds true for the other parts. I'm not going to do this in detail right now, so you get an idea of this, and I will move on to the next parts. So our skeleton becomes more and more defined, and we can now add more flash to this. For example, some bass, texture, or some percussions. Let's do this now. Here is our texture loop. So I will maybe bring this in and out, doesn't really matter right now. And also I will probably not leave this exactly at the current level, but this is something you can change later on. I'm interested in moving fast. It's really important because you don't want to get out of flow state while arrangement. Now, right now I'm talking to you, so I'm probably getting ripped out of flow state for sure, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to show this technique to you, and you can then do it in flow state with all of the benefits. Question is, where do you drop these kinds of things? So typically in these points where you change something in the kick drum or where you extremely open up this macro, these are typically great points to also add in other elements or take away elements. And by the way, I also normally add in a couple of markers, which makes a lot of sense because they give you like a visual structure. So you can add a locator somewhere in here and give it a name like intro or build up or whatever. And then you have more visual overview over your entire song. So this is what this could look like. I have a couple of markers in here and they give me more visual orientation. Let's take a couple of other elements here. Let's see what we have. Okay, this is one percussion loop. That's interesting. Yeah, this is nice. This is kind of foreshadowing some of the other things. So foreshadowing is a really interesting technique. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear more about that. I'm just going to drop this in here. So I'm entirely going by feel and then listen to it and we'll see if it works out or not. Very nice. And you do the same thing for the other percussion elements. I'm going to speed this up a little bit so you get an overview of what this could look like in the end. So I have this really nice loop here. I can use this, for example, in parts where there's not so much lead playing. So let's say I bring down the lead almost completely in the beginning of the breakdown. This would be a perfect way to sneak in something else that takes over this role for a while. So this percussion loop could then act as some kind of secondary lead. Let me show you the transition point here. And then the lead is kind of sneaking in behind this. So this is super cool. This is one of my favorite techniques. Obviously, the transition point itself is not perfect. I would probably add a little bit of a swoosh or a hit to make the transition flow more smoothly. But right now for the rough arrangement, this really doesn't matter at all. And later on, you also automate the other elements. But for the very beginning part of your track, like this first phase of arrangement, it really doesn't matter. You don't have to aim for perfection. You aim for getting something done. Let's add a couple of main percussions here. Duplicate these ones over. And then you can increase the intensity even more here when it goes into the breakdown. It's also one of my favorite techniques. So for example, open hats make a lot of sense to sneak in at some point where you want more intensity. Very nice. I mean, we haven't even added bass. It still sounds quite cool. So I'm going to use some bass here as well. Maybe I don't want the bass to be in here from the very beginning. Maybe I bring it in around here. So a lot of people ask me, why do I duplicate this? Why do I not just extend things like this? You can do both, of course, but this lets me very easily just take a couple of them out. So if I don't want bass to be playing here, only in this section, it's very easy to do. It's just my preferred way of working, but nothing is wrong with the other approach. So let's use a little bit of bass here as well. Maybe bring it in like 50% of the breakdown. Then we have it, of course, in here, more or less until the end. Maybe not here. And yeah, I also would like to delete the bass in the last couple of bars before the actual drop hits, because then we have more impact when the drop hits. So this looks very promising already. I will now add in a couple of percussions in later parts of the drop. And I just go more or less by a felt structure. So I think this should do. There's like no real strategy behind this. I first of all throw something in and then I listen to this and see what it does emotionally to me. So this is definitely, there's no right or wrong, and you should do the same. You should also try to go by feel and stay in that flow state. Let's make it more intense around here. I also extend this. The second additional lead percussion layer, whatever you want to call this is something we can sneak in at a later point. So for example, around here, just to bring in some new spice. Maybe this is the part that rings out the track overall. Cool. Yeah, and so as you can see, we have a rough arrangement going. It's probably not perfect, but yeah, we can skip through a couple of sections and see how this sounds. This would be a classic point where I then take out the hi-hat again, just because we've increased the intensity before. It's a very good point to then decrease it again, and maybe even take out the other percussion loop. So this is why this approach helps so much with creating tension and release. And the problem that I see most producers make is they wait for these automation and modulation moves until the very end of their songwriting process. But honestly, in electronic music, this makes up the actual emotional essence of the sonic storytelling. So my recommendation for you is to do this early on. Try out this skeleton arrangement approach. Let me know how it works for you. I would love to hear in the comments if you got any value out of this. Also, if you have new ideas for videos, if there's something you want to ask me, leave a comment below and I will see you in the next video.